Before I tell you what really happened on the night I swapped my cheating husband's lube for glue and the firefighters had to pull them apart like a scene straight out of a shocking psychological drama, I want you to listen to every word of this story because this isn't just entertainment, this is a deep look into how a human mind breaks, how betrayal changes a person from gentle to dangerous, how love can turn into something dark without warning, and I want you to stay with me till the end. Because every second you watch helps this real story reach more people and opens their eyes to the hidden psychological truth behind relationships, dishonesty, and emotional explosions, so take a breath and keep watching because what you're about to hear might sound crazy, but it's exactly how real-life psychology operates when someone's heart is torn apart, and it all started long before the glue incident, long before the firefighters came, long before she even thought of revenge, because deep inside every relationship that breaks this badly, there are small signs that most people ignore, signs that whisper something is wrong even when everything looks normal on the outside, and she started noticing those signs the way anyone would, like the way he suddenly became overprotective of his phone, the way he started coming home late with weak excuses, the way he began showering the moment he entered the house as if water could wash off the guilt he was carrying on his skin, and even though she kept telling herself maybe she was overthinking, her heart knew something wasn't right because the human brain is wired to detect lies even before words prove them wrong, and one day everything became too clear to ignore when she found something small but powerful, a tiny message popping up on his phone saying, "I missed last night, can't wait to see you again," and even though the message was short, it stabbed her like a knife, and instead of confronting him right away, she watched him. Quietly the way people do when they're hurt but pretending everything is fine, she observed every move, every lie, every shift in his tone, every moment he tried to hide something, and with each day the pain inside her didn't fade, it grew, it transformed, it turned into something she had never felt before, a mix of heartbreak, anger, and psychological pressure that twisted her thoughts until she could barely recognize herself. And it's important to understand that no one plans revenge in 1 second, it comes slowly, shaped by sleepless nights, unanswered questions, and moments where a broken heart keeps asking why wasn't I enough, why did he do this, why did he choose someone else after everything we built, and that why grew inside her like fire until one evening life placed her in a situation that changed everything, because when she discovered the truth fully, photos, messages, calls, all the proof she never wanted, something inside her didn't just break, it snapped, and the version of her that always forgave, always trusted, always waited for honesty simply disappeared, replaced by a woman who wanted him to feel even a tiny piece of the pain he put into her skin, her chest, her mind, and that was the moment she planned the one thing she knew would hit him unexpectedly, something symbolic, something that reflected exactly how stuck she felt in the relationship, how trapped she had been in his lies, something that would force him to experience even one moment of helplessness the way she had experienced helplessness for months. So on the night he prepared to meet his secret lover, she walked into the bathroom where he kept everything he used for those disgusting nights, and with a quiet hand but a loud heart she swapped the bottle, replacing the lube with industrial-strength adhesive, and she didn't laugh, she didn't cry, she didn't smile, she didn't feel victorious, she only felt a strange calmness like the peace a person feels after holding pain for too long. And the next part of the story came like a storm because when he and the other woman tried to enjoy their night, they screamed in shock as the glue did its job, bonding them together in a way no one ever wants, and within minutes chaos exploded, panic filled the room, and someone called emergency services. And firefighters arrived trying not to laugh but also trying to stay professional as they struggled to separate two adults stuck together in the most embarrassing and painful situation anyone could imagine. And while all of this was happening she sat in her living room drinking tea, not happy, not celebrating, just emotionally empty because revenge doesn't heal the wound, it only shows how deep it was, and that night she realized something important. Betrayal breaks people in ways they can't explain, and when someone feels unheard for too long, they can do things they never imagined they were capable of. And before I continue the rest of this insane story I want you to stay with me, because what happens next reveals the deepest psychological truth behind relationships, cheating, and emotional survival, and I want you to watch till the end because this real-life lesson might save someone from heartbreak, or from making decisions born out of pain instead of clarity. So don't go anywhere because the next part will show you exactly how psychology explains this kind of emotional explosion and why some people break in silence while others break loudly enough That the whole neighborhood ends up watching firefighters trying to undo a mistake created by a broken heart. When the firefighters finally managed to separate them and her husband was rushed to the hospital covered in humiliation and pain stronger than anything he had ever imagined, she sat alone in the quiet of their house, and it was the first time in months that silence didn't feel like a punishment but instead felt like a doorway to self-realization, because for the first time she wasn't crying, she wasn't begging for answers, she wasn't replaying the past in her mind, she was simply breathing. Breathing like someone who had been underwater for too long and finally reached the surface. And while she didn't feel proud about what had happened, she also didn't feel guilty, because betrayal has a way of twisting a person's emotional compass until wrong feels understandable and hurt feels like a reason rather than an accident, and as she sat there she remembered all the little things she used to ignore, like the nights he would pretend to be tired just so he could message someone else, or the way he would roll his eyes when she asked him innocent questions, or how he slowly made her feel like she wasn't enough even though she poured her whole life into the relationship. And the more she thought about it, the clearer it became that his cheating didn't start recently, it was a long pattern of disrespect that slowly erased her confidence, and that is something people don't talk about enough, because cheating isn't just a physical act, it is emotional damage, psychological damage. And every time he lied to her, he chipped away a small piece of her identity until she became someone who didn't even recognize her own reflection anymore, and this is something psychology proves again and again. That emotional betrayal can trigger survival instincts in a person, instincts that push them into actions they never thought they could take. And that night after the firefighters left and the neighbors stopped whispering and the police finally wrote their final report, she felt something surprising: release, a kind of emotional freedom that comes when a person finally stops pretending everything is okay, and she knew this wasn't the end of the story, she knew there were consequences waiting in the morning, questions she would have to answer, explanations she would have to give. But for one moment she allowed herself to feel the raw truth inside her, the truth that she had stayed loyal to a man who didn't value loyalty, the truth that she had sacrificed years for someone who couldn't even sacrifice honesty, the truth that she had loved someone who loved himself more than anything else, and while she didn't justify what she did, she understood why she did it, because sometimes a person's mind becomes a battlefield, and when the heart loses too many times, the brain steps in with a reaction, sometimes chaotic, sometimes loud, sometimes shocking, but always human. And as she lay on the couch staring at the ceiling, she wondered what people would say if they knew the full story. Would they call her crazy? Would they call her stupid? Would they call her evil? Or would they understand that behind every extreme action there is extreme pain? And she knew that most people judge the result without understanding the journey, but her journey mattered, her pain mattered, her voice mattered, and for once in her life she felt her emotions weren't small, weren't silly, weren't meaningless. They were the reason she survived everything he put her through. And the next morning when the hospital called her, she didn't rush, she didn't panic, she simply listened as the nurse explained the situation, and she realized something powerful: she didn't need him anymore, she didn't need the relationship anymore, she didn't need the version of herself that always forgave him, because somewhere between the glue, the lies, the screams, and the firefighters, she found a truth she had been ignoring for years: she deserved better, she deserved peace, she deserved love that didn't require suffering. And before we move to the next part of this story, I want you to remember something important, something real, something psychology teaches us again and again: when a person is pushed beyond their emotional limit, their actions become a reflection of their pain, not their personality. And while her revenge was messy, chaotic, and unforgettable, it was born from wounds you can't see, the kind that live inside the chest like ghosts. So stay with me, because the next part will show you how everything changed after that night and how one decision shaped her entire future in ways she never imagined. When she finally decided to visit him at the hospital later that day, not because she missed him or because she wanted to fix anything but simply because she needed closure, she walked through the sliding doors with a calmness people only feel after surviving emotional storms that nearly break them, and as she entered the ward, she saw him lying there with his face pale from embarrassment and pain, and the moment he saw her, guilt washed over him as if he suddenly remembered every lie he ever told, every moment he made her feel small, every night he spent with someone else while she waited at home pretending everything was fine. And he tried to act angry, tried to pretend he was the victim, but his voice cracked because deep inside he knew the truth. He knew that if he hadn't cheated, if he hadn't lied, if he hadn't betrayed her trust again and again, none of this would have happened. And instead of yelling or breaking down, She simply stood there looking at him with a kind of emotional distance he had never seen in her before, a distance that comes when love finally dies, when pain becomes heavier than memories, when the mind steps out of the cage the heart had built around it, and he began to speak, stumbling over excuses, blaming stress, blaming work, blaming everything but himself, because cheaters always have a story ready, always have a reason that sounds good on the surface but means nothing underneath, and as he kept talking, she didn't respond, didn't interrupt, didn't give him the satisfaction of emotional reaction. She simply listened like someone watching a movie they've seen too many times, a movie that no longer makes them cry, no longer makes them angry, because they finally understand that the ending will never change. And when he finally ran out of excuses, he looked at her with desperation in his eyes, asking why she did it, why she went so far, why she couldn't just confront him, and she told him the truth with a steady voice, a voice shaped by months of emotional exhaustion, telling him she did confront him over and over again, in her questions, in her worries, in her attempts to save their marriage, but he ignored her every time, dismissed her every time, called her crazy every time, made her doubt her own instincts every time, and that kind of manipulation is a slow poison, the kind that doesn't kill you physically but destroys you emotionally, mentally, psychologically, and when she said those words, he didn't respond because deep inside he knew it was true. He knew he had broken her long before she ever broke him. He knew he had pushed her to the point where her mind stopped caring about consequences and only focused on release, and as she stood there, she realized something she had never understood before, something psychologists repeat but people never take seriously until it happens to them. A person doesn't lose themselves all at once. They lose themselves slowly, quietly, piece by piece, until one day they don't recognize the person in the mirror, and that day becomes the turning point, the moment everything changes, and for her, that turning point was the night she swapped the bottles, the night she finally took back control of a life he had twisted with lies, and as she turned to leave the hospital room, she could feel years of emotional weight dropping off her shoulders like chains finally breaking, and she didn't look back because she knew if she did, she might remember the good moments, the early years, the laughter, the promises they once made, and she didn't want to remember any of it anymore. She wanted her heart to stay strong, her mind to stay clear, her future to stay open, and she walked out of that room not as a broken wife but as a woman rediscovering herself, and the moment she stepped into the sunlight outside the hospital, she felt something new, freedom, a quiet freedom that wrapped around her like fresh air after being trapped in a dark room for too long. And she promised herself she would never again give her heart to someone who treated it carelessly, never again lower her worth to fit someone else's comfort, never again silence her instincts just to keep someone who didn't deserve her. And before we go into what happened next in her life and how she rebuilt herself from the pieces he tried to shatter, I want you to stay with me because the next part reveals how healing truly begins after a person escapes emotional destruction and how psychology explains the strength that rises from someone who finally walks away from a life that only hurt them. When she returned home after leaving the hospital, the house felt different, not because anything had changed physically but because mentally she was no longer the same woman who had cried herself to sleep on that couch, and for the first time in a long time she didn't walk in with fear of what excuse he would give or what lie she would have to pretend to believe. Instead she walked into silence that felt peaceful, a silence that didn't demand explanations or apologies, and as she sat down, she allowed herself to replay everything that had happened not with pain this time but with clarity, like someone finally watching their life without the fog of manipulation or emotional confusion, and she realized how much she had sacrificed, how many times she stayed quiet to keep the relationship alive, how many times she forgave things that broke her inside, and she wondered why she ever thought love meant suffering, why she believed loyalty meant staying even when the other person destroyed her trust. And this is something many people don't understand until they go through it themselves, how easy it is to lose yourself when you love someone who loves your obedience more than your happiness. And as she reflected on everything, she remembered the early years of their marriage, the dreams they had, the plans they made, the promises that once felt so real, but now all of it felt like scenes from a life that belonged to someone else, someone who no longer existed because the woman she had become was stronger, wiser, and tired of being someone's emotional punching bag. And the truth is, healing doesn't start the moment you leave someone. Healing starts when you finally understand why you should have left sooner, and that understanding hit her in waves, each one washing away another layer of guilt and confusion he had planted in her over the years. And she began to clean the house not because she wanted everything to be perfect but because cleaning felt symbolic, like she was washing away the memories, the arguments, the lies, the nights she stayed awake waiting for him, and as she cleaned, she found old photos of them smiling, holding hands, looking like a perfect couple, but instead of crying she just stared at them for a moment and whispered to herself that the woman in the photo had tried her best, had given everything she had, and that was enough. And she placed the photos in a box because she didn't want to throw them away but she didn't want to keep them on display either, and then she opened her phone and blocked his number, not out of anger but out of self-protection because she knew if she left even the smallest door open, he would try to creep back into her emotions with apologies and promises he would never keep, and she wasn't willing to fall into that cycle again, not after everything she had gone through, not after she had finally awakened to her own worth. And as the days passed, she started focusing on herself, doing small things she used to love but stopped doing to keep him happy, like reading in the morning sunlight, taking long walks, cooking meals she enjoyed, listening to music that made her feel alive, and slowly, gently, piece by piece, she began rebuilding the relationship she had neglected the most, the relationship with herself. And psychology says that when a person finally steps out of a toxic emotional environment, their brain begins to heal, their self-esteem slowly returns, their breathing becomes deeper, their mind becomes quieter, and she felt all of that happening inside her like a soft transformation she didn't have to force. It just happened naturally once the source of her emotional damage was removed, and one evening while she sat watching the sunset from her balcony, she realized something important, something she wished she had understood years earlier, that sometimes the pain of losing someone is nothing compared to the pain of keeping them. And as the colors of the sky shifted from gold to orange to deep red, she smiled for the first time in months, a real smile, not a forced one, not a survival smile, but a smile born from relief, peace, and acceptance. And before I continue to the next part of her journey and show you how she transformed her life after this chaos, I want you to stay with me because the next part reveals how she faced the world, how she handled judgment, how she built a new identity from the ashes of her old life, and how psychology explains the powerful rebirth that happens when someone finally chooses themselves over the person who broke them. As the days slowly turned into weeks, she began to notice how different life felt without the constant weight of his lies holding her down, and even though people around her whispered, judged, laughed, or acted like they knew the whole story when they only knew the dramatic ending, she learned to stay calm because she finally understood that people always talk but they never stay to feel your pain. They never sit with you through the nights when your mind is breaking, they never wipe your tears when you collapse from emotional exhaustion. They only show up when the story becomes interesting enough to gossip about, and instead of letting their words hurt her, she let them flow past her like wind because she knew the truth, she knew the journey, she knew the scars, and she knew that surviving what she survived was proof of her strength, not her shame. And the more she embraced this new mindset, the more she realized how much of her life she had wasted worrying about how others saw her. How much energy she gave to maintaining an image of a perfect marriage when the reality behind closed doors was anything but perfect, and she promised herself she would never again let society's opinions control her decisions, because society didn't hold her while she cried, society didn't comfort her when her heart shattered, society didn't hear the lies that broke her, so society had no right to judge her healing. And as she slowly began stepping back into the world, not as a broken wife but as a woman rediscovering her worth, she noticed how lighter her steps felt, how brighter the morning sunlight looked, how softer her evenings became, because she wasn't living in fear anymore, she wasn't waiting for apologies that never came, she wasn't sacrificing her mental health to keep someone who didn't deserve her. And something unexpected happened one afternoon while she was sitting at a small cafe sipping her tea, watching people pass by, simply enjoying being alive without emotional chaos. A woman at the next table recognized her from the recent gossip and approached her with hesitation, expecting her to be ashamed or defensive, but instead she found a woman who had already accepted everything, and this stranger sat down and softly told her she had been going through the same thing, living with a man who manipulated her emotions daily, and she asked how she found the courage to walk away, how she managed to break the cycle, and in that moment she realized something powerful, that her story, as messy and dramatic as it was, had the ability to help someone else step out of emotional darkness. And she told the woman the truth, that courage doesn't arrive all at once, it comes slowly, through pain, through silence, through nights spent questioning your worth, through moments where you stop trying to fix someone and start trying to save yourself. And the woman cried softly at the table because she had never heard someone speak about heartbreak with such clarity. And that day she understood that healing is not just something you do for yourself. Sometimes healing becomes a light for someone else who is stuck in the same darkness you once lived in. And that night when she went home, she felt proud for the first time in a very long time, not proud of the revenge or the chaos, but proud of the strength she grew while putting herself back together, proud of the woman she was becoming, the woman who no longer needed validation from anyone, the woman who now understood that real love shouldn't feel like fear, shouldn't feel like confusion, shouldn't feel like pain hidden under fake smiles. And as she prepared dinner for herself, playing her favorite songs, she felt something she thought she would never feel again: contentment, that simple but rare feeling of being okay with herself, her past, and her future. And psychology says that contentment is a sign that your mind has finally started to heal. And she felt it deeply, like a quiet peace settling into her bones. And before the night ended she sat on her balcony watching the stars, thinking about how strange life is, how something that almost destroyed her ended up becoming the very thing that rebuilt her. And she whispered to herself that sometimes the worst endings create the best beginnings. And before we move to the next part of this story, where her healing becomes even stronger and she learns how to rebuild her life completely on her own terms, I want you to stay with me because the next paragraph shows the most powerful transformation she goes through, the moment she stops being defined by her past and starts being defined by her future. As her healing grew stronger and the emotional fog finally lifted from her mind, she began to rebuild her life in ways she never thought possible, starting with the small details people often overlook, like waking up without dread, drinking her morning tea without checking her phone for messages that always disappointed her, walking through her home without the fear of triggering an argument. And this new freedom felt strange at first, like wearing clothes that didn't belong to her yet, but over time it became familiar, comforting, empowering. And she realized that she wasn't just healing, she was transforming, becoming someone who didn't just survive pain but learned from it, evolved from it. And suddenly the things she used to tolerate didn't feel acceptable anymore, the things she used to forgive didn't feel forgivable anymore. And the love she once gave so freely now felt like something precious she would never waste on the wrong person again. And this shift was powerful, because for years she had been conditioned to put his needs before her own, to shrink herself so he could feel bigger, to silence her instincts so he wouldn't feel accused. And now that she was finally away from him, her mind began to reset itself, like a computer rebooting after years of malfunctioning software, and every day became a lesson in independence. From learning how to take care of the things he used to handle to discovering new hobbies that helped her reconnect with the world. And she found herself smiling more, laughing at things she once ignored, noticing beauty in small moments like the warmth of sunlight on her skin or the sound of rain hitting the window. And these tiny joys became the foundation of her new life. And slowly the fear of being alone transformed into the peace of choosing solitude over chaos. And one morning she woke up and realized she hadn't thought about him once the previous day, not his lies, not his cheating, not the drama he created. And for a moment she sat in bed stunned, because she didn't think healing would ever reach this point, the point where memories stopped hurting and started fading like old stories that no longer mattered. And that's when she understood something psychology teaches but people forget, that the brain will naturally release pain once it no longer feels threatened. And she felt that release in every part of her body, like a burden melting away, like breathing fully for the first time in years. And as she continued growing emotionally, she also began exploring her dreams again, dreams she had buried under marriage responsibilities, like taking a small course she always wanted to learn, traveling to places she thought she would only visit after retirement, meeting people with genuine hearts, forming new friendships that weren't built on fear or control. And with every step she took towards her new future, she realized how deeply she had been trapped in the past. And one evening she looked at herself in the mirror and didn't see a broken woman anymore. She saw strength, she saw wisdom, she saw resilience, she saw someone who had survived betrayal and still had the courage to love life again. And that reflection became her reminder that pain doesn't destroy everyone. Some people turn pain into power, and she had become one of those people. And this new version of herself was calmer, smarter, less trusting of sweet words but more trusting of her own instincts. And she learned how to set boundaries, real boundaries, the kind she never had in her marriage, boundaries that protected her peace like a gate protecting a garden. and even though healing wasn't a straight line and she still had moments where old memories resurfaced, she no longer felt scared of them because they didn't control her anymore, they didn't define her anymore. And before I take you to the final chapter of this story where everything comes full circle and her transformation reaches its strongest point, I want you to stay with me because the last paragraph will show how she closes the door on her past forever and how she delivers a final message that every listener needs to hear. As months passed and she grew into the strongest version of herself she had ever known, life began to show her a different kind of beauty, the kind that only appears after someone has walked through fire and come out the other side not burned but reborn. And one day she received a message she didn't expect, a message from her ex-husband asking if they could talk, claiming he had changed, claiming he had realized her worth, claiming he was ready to become a better man, but instead of feeling confused or tempted or emotionally shaken the way she would have in the past, she felt absolutely nothing, because healing had taken her so far forward that his words no longer had the power to pull her backward, and after reading the message she put her phone down calmly, realizing that this was the moment she had been waiting for, not because she missed him, but because she needed to know she was finally free from everything he once represented, and she replied with a simple message telling him she didn't owe him anything anymore, that her life was no longer connected to his mistakes, and that she had closed that chapter forever. And when she hit send, it felt like the last piece of emotional weight lifted off her shoulders, and she stood by the window looking outside at the world that once felt scary without him, now feeling like a canvas she could paint with her own choices, her own dreams, her own voice. And as she reflected on everything she had survived, she understood something deeply important about life and psychology, that sometimes the universe allows something painful to happen not to punish us but to push us out of places we don't belong, push us toward growth we wouldn't choose willingly, push us into a stronger version of ourselves that only heartbreak can reveal. And she realized that the glue incident, as wild and unforgettable as it was, wasn't the real story. The real story was how a woman who almost lost herself found a way back to her own soul, how she learned to value her own heart more than someone else's approval, how she learned that love should never feel like fear, and as she stood there smiling softly at her own reflection, she whispered to herself that she was finally free, truly free, not because she took revenge, not because he suffered, but because she healed, and healing will always be the greatest victory a person can claim after being broken. And before this story ends, she wanted others to learn from her journey, to know that staying in a relationship just to avoid loneliness is the biggest self-betrayal, to know that walking away is not failure but the beginning of freedom, to know that no amount of love can fix someone who doesn't want to change, and to know that anyone who is listening to her story right now deserves a life where trust is real, loyalty is mutual, and peace is normal. And if you are still here listening, then her message to you is simple: never lose yourself for someone who wouldn't lose anything for you, and never let anyone convince you that your worth depends on their love, because your worth was never theirs to decide. And as this story comes to an end, she hopes that you carry this lesson with you, that you protect your heart the way she learned to protect hers, and that you choose yourself even when the world tells you to choose someone else. And if her journey touched you, inspired you, or opened your eyes even a little, then don't forget to support this channel. Drop your thoughts in the comments, share this video so more people can learn the truth behind emotional healing, and make sure you subscribe because your support helps bring more real stories, more powerful lessons, and more psychological insight straight to you. And remember this one last thing before you go: you deserve love that doesn't break you, a life that doesn't drain you, and a future that doesn't repeat your past. So choose wisely, choose bravely, and choose yourself every single time.